We're continuing with the Jean-Paul Sartre novels that we started looking at last week, and we began with this series of novels dealing with the events leading up to the Second World War. So we'll continue that today. Next week we might try and go on to this other shorter novel that he wrote called Nausea, in which he laid out his, I suppose, philosophical ideas more plainly, but these other novels obliquely talk about some of those things in relation to these characters. Anyway, so we had already mentioned Mathieu Delarue, the main protagonist, I suppose, of the whole series, a professor of philosophy in France, very much a kind of an alter ego of Jean-Paul Sartre himself, I suppose. And talked a bit about his idea that there is no God. He believes there is no God. There is no, after we finish our life on this earth, there is nothing. But it's important while we are on this earth to be free, whatever that means. So it's a complete existentialist picture, I guess, really similar to what Camus had been talking about. And also mentioned that in the novels he's talking about a lot of some of the women that he's had in his life, and remembers them with a kind of a nostalgia and maybe a regret, and maybe kind of gently castigating himself for perhaps some of his weaknesses and failures in relation to them. But at the same time, and we mentioned this in relation to Graham Greene as well, it's a very different kind of novelist, but similar in that respect. Although he's kind of castigating himself all the time, you get the sense that he's boasting really as well. So there's that aspect to it. And then we also mentioned briefly this other figure, Daniel, who's the homosexual and who likes to have sexual relationships with boys and young men. Matthew offloads his problem with one of the women he's trying to get rid of by somehow convincing Daniel to marry her. So we also mentioned the fact that Daniel has this searing experience of knowing that God is looking into his soul, and Matthew finds that very disturbing and becomes quite angry about it and angrily screws up the piece of paper that contains the letter that Daniel has written describing this. So it's interesting that Daniel, this person who loves to corrupt other people sexually and in other ways, when he has this experience of God looking into him and knowing him right through and seeing what he's really like, walking around with that knowledge all the time, he doesn't have the experience of being condemned or being judged or threatened with some eternal punishment. He just has the experience of being seen and understood. He's not even being lectured to, he's just being understood. And it seems in a way that, although this is not stated outright in the book, that perhaps Matthew's indignation and angry rejection of that, and also Sartre's angry rejection of that, the fact that he just screws up this letter and tosses it out the window, is because it's not conforming to his idea of what God, if there were a God, would be like. I mean, he would like to think of God as being an angry, vindictive judge who wants to condemn and blame and punish. But the experience that Daniel has is rather of one who just understands totally and sees totally. So in that respect too, one of the other characters in the book, I think, is this fellow Philippe, who, as we mentioned, I think last week also, is one of the people who is sexually and morally corrupted by Daniel. So Philippe is a young man who lives with his mother and stepfather. His stepfather is a general in the French army, and he makes no attempt to conceal his disdain and disgust really for Philippe. Sees him as a weakling and a coward and effeminate and everything that the general can't endure, and he tolerates him simply because for the sake of his mother, who is the general's new wife. But he's obviously not a very attractive father figure for Philippe, in that he, as said, he makes plain his disgust and rejection of him. So then this also brings in the idea of the reprieve, which many of the characters that we're going to look at are caught up in this reprieve, which is the title of the second book in the set. And it's talking, of course, about the events leading up to the Munich conference in late 1938. So, as we know, what was happening then was that Hitler was becoming increasingly powerful and wanting to extend his power onto the world stage, and he'd got to the point where he wanted to absorb into Germany part of what was Czechoslovakia, the part that had joined Germany, and a lot of German-speaking and ethnic German people were living in that area. And so the Western powers was inclined to regard that as a provocation to war if he actually invaded and took over that area. So it looked as though war was about to break out between Britain and France, and on one side, and Germany on the other. And so a lot of the characters in the book are preoccupied with that thought, that this huge war is going to break out. They can still remember what the First World War was like, or know about what it was like, or the millions of deaths. And they're thinking, well, this is going to be the same or worse. This could be the end of our lives. It could involve us in horror and terrible things. So that's what they're thinking about, and they're wanting to someone to take part in it, someone to escape from it. So Philippe certainly doesn't want to be involved in a war and doesn't want to be a soldier. So he also attends anti-war protests, and he's attacked and actually beaten up by some of the more patriotic people that he encounters in those protests. He then wants to obtain a false passport so that he can escape France to avoid conscription, and it's in the course of that he comes in contact with Daniel, who ultimately takes him into his confidence and into his flat, and then sexually molests him, more or less. So many of the characters are involved in this aspect of, do we go to war or do we not go to war? So there's another character called Gros Louis, who's a sheep herder who lives up in the mountains, who's a very big, uncouth, unshaven-looking character that the people that he encounters in the towns are kind of horrified by his appearance and afraid of him. Some take advantage of what they see as his, I suppose, stupidity and naivety, and some rob him and attack him and defy him, just dislike him intensely. And then he eventually is conscripted into the French army and is treated very harshly there. There's a young couple called Boris and his sister Lola. So Boris, they're Eastern European, so Boris, on the other hand, is very eager to get involved in the war against the Nazis, and does everything he can to get him into the fight. And just leading up to this Munich conference, when it looks as though war is about to break out, but conscription hasn't been introduced yet in France, where Boris is living at the time. He's so eager to be involved that he doesn't wait for conscription to be introduced, so he actually goes and enlists in the French army. And then when the Munich conference happens, war's averted. The war won't actually happen for another year now. And so there will be no conscription, but now Boris is in the army anyway, and he can't get out of it because he's enlisted, but they're not going to be fighting. So Boris is in the opposite, has a predicament which is the opposite of Philippe's in a way. He wants to fight, he's in the army, but the French army is not going to fight. So what does he do? He then wants to go escape to England and try and join the army there, because he thinks the English are more likely to fight. Another character who appears in all of these books is a man called Gomez, a Spaniard, who is a friend of Matthew, the protagonist, as we've said, of most of the novels. So Gomez is a real man of action. And, he's been fighting in the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side, and he's very frustrated and disappointed in the French intellectuals like Matthew, the communists in the French society, who he thinks should be joining the fight that he's involved with in Spain against the fascists. And Matthew and his colleagues won't get involved, and the French intellectual elite in general won't get involved. But Matthew Gomez is directly involved in the thick of all the fighting. So he maintains his friendship with Matthew, but is disappointed by him, feels that he's not living up to his ideals. So then ultimately in the final novel, Iron in the Soul, when war has actually broken out, Gomez is now in New York and he's happy that the French have been defeated, and because they wouldn't support the cause when they should have earlier on. And he becomes a kind of a communist agitator eventually amongst the French prisoners of war. So getting back to the middle part, I mean, other characters, there's a couple of Sudeten people who live in this part of Czechoslovakia, which adjoins Germany, which was actually, Hitler was given permission to take that at the time of the Munich conference. So it describes a bit of their feelings. There's another fellow who, actually is Charles, who's a patient in a hospital who is apparently paraplegic and dependent on care, and he's in a situation where there's a nurse in the hospital that he's in who obliges him by kind of sexually arousing him when he needs to, which he can't do on his own. And that's his whole life is caught up with her. And then at the time when it looks as though wars are about to break out in late 1938, a significant upheaval in the French society. People are moved around, evacuated from one place to another. The patients in a hospital are shifted somewhere else, and the nurse that he has is shifted to a different place, and he loses her, and the thing that was so important to his life is no longer available, and he doesn't see any way that he's going to get that back. And similar to that, there's another man who called Pierre, who happens to see a book with photographs of people with horribly disfiguring facial injuries. And seeing that, he's kind of consumed with the thought, well, if I get involved in the war, something like this might happen to me. And he can't get that idea out of his mind. And his partner, called Maud, who becomes aware of that, then considers him to be a coward and becomes quite disgusted by him. And Maud herself is a violinist. She's the leader of a ladies' band that plays on board ships for entertainment and is kind of routinely expected to more or less prostitute herself to the captain of the ship on every voyage. So some of the other characters, there's some of the real political figures involved, like Neville Chamberlain and I think Daladier, I think the French Prime Minister at the time, and I think Masaryk, who I think was the Czech leader. So they make brief appearances. They all have different attitudes to the war. So with Matthew's attitude, it seems that he would, it's not really spelled out quite clearly, but it appears that he doesn't altogether, he would not regret the outbreak of a war, in that in Marxist doctrine it might bring about a worldwide revolution, such as was thought to happen at the time of the First World War. So he would be glad of that conflagration. And ultimately, when the war does break out a year after the Munich conference and the French are defeated easily, what happens is something that he dreaded more than anything, which was a kind of a compromise agreement between the Nazis and France, where there's a kind of a peace, and the French are just subjugated to this external power, but there's no revolution. So anyway, there's no clear, really, exposition of all that, but so I'll have to leave that there because we've run out of time for this episode.